All right. Thanks folks for being here. Sorry for kind of the slightly late start. I'm excited to dive into how to plan an action. And since today's going to be a little bit interactive and it looks like we only have one person right now online, what I'll probably do is have that person join us on audio during the more interactive portion of things. And we'll kind of work through things together that way. So just kind of a heads up. For folks who may be joining us online or who may watch this later online, we'll make sure to have everything attached so that people can participate at home as well. So let's dive in. How to plan an action. We're going to talk about how to create an action from concept all the way to reality. All right, so first, let's talk about what we're going to do today so that we are all completely on the same page. First off, we're going to define what we mean by action. Then we're going to contextualize actions as a part of a campaign. We'll explain what all those words mean, get on the same page. Learn the steps of action planning, practice action planning, and then have a final discussion. So first off, what is an action? An action is defined as a planned and coordinated event that furthers a campaign to accomplish a goal. And now, that's not the only definition we ever use, but that's what we're going to use today. So from there, you might ask, well, what's a campaign? A campaign is a series of organized, planned actions that put increasing pressure on a decision maker or target to take action that we want them to take. I adapted that from Marshall Gans and his work, Organizing People, Power, and Change. I also adapt a couple of his graphics for this. So let's look at what a campaign is real quick. When we talk about a campaign, we're talking about again, a series of actions that help make change in this larger situation. Usually begins with sort of a foundation of, community and relationship building. Then there's some sort of campaign kickoff. Now, a lot of times when people think of campaign kickoffs, they think about a partisan campaign, somebody running for office. They have a big party or something to say, hey, I'm running for X, support me, whatever, right? Which is great. And it essentially means the same thing in this context too. Activist campaigns have kickoffs too. Think about the Poor People's Campaign and how there were a lot of large events to kind of herald that happening. Or think about any time you were involved with a campaign in, local city government. A great example might be Platform for Change that SCAR put out. When we started to push for those policies here in Spokane, we had a big press conference, a massive event that said, hey, this is happening, support it. From there are all these peaks, right? Where essentially the goal is being escalated. And then you've got the climax action and then the resolution. That climax action or that peak, examples you might think of might be something like the March on Washington, right? I believe it was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that we always think of, where I have the dream, I've been to the mountaintop. That speech was delivered by Martin Luther King. That was a big peak action, but there was all kinds of stuff that built up to it. It didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't spontaneous. And then you have the resolution. That resolution might be getting what we want, a policy put in place, a law repealed, a candidate elected, or it may be us not getting what we want and us having to sort of reset and begin all over again. Well, somewhere around here. Foundation has already been laid, but then we start going again. And when we talk about campaigns, we're talking about something that can last anywhere from a few weeks to years. So when we talk about an action, we're talking about these things that happen along these peaks, right? These could be marches. These could be turning in a giant stack of petitions. This could be a sit-in somewhere. This could be the occupation of a public building. It could be a giant gathering in a park. It could be a lot of different things. So that's what we're going to zero in on today. If you're talking about one of those events, right, a march or something like that, how do you go about planning that? So I'm going to run through these steps real quick, first all at once, and then we'll spend time digging into each one. The action planning steps essentially go like this. You determine your participants, that is who's going to be involved. You determine your target, that is who it is you're trying to make do something. You have to choose your action as in the physical thing that you're doing, right? We're marching to this place, or we're sitting in here, or we're all laying down a rose at this location, whatever it is. You plan that action, how do we make this march happen? How do we make this demonstration happen? You plan your action homework. That's one of my favorite parts. Doesn't get talked about. This is what happens after the big event. It answers the what now question, right? You execute everything you planned out. You party. That is an important step. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And then you follow up with your community. So let's dig into those. First off, who should participate depends on the answer to a couple of questions. Firstly, who is directly impacted by the issue? And who are the stakeholders in the process and outcome? An example that I give is if you're addressing renters' rights, for example, something that's a big discussion right now as the COVID-19 epidemic and a lot of economic factors surrounding that have led rent to go up for a lot of people who may not have had the opportunity to work as much as they should have in the last year. Renters' rights have been a huge current discussion. Those who are most directly affected are the renters, the people who pay other people to live in a building somewhere. But additional stakeholders, people who hold a stake, who have some kind of personal interest in the process and the outcome of how renters' rights are approached, include landlords, property managers, building maintenance and employees. People who you may not consider immediately to be a part of what the action is, but they have a role to play in this. Determining your participants is crucial. You want to take time to list out all of your stakeholders, even the people you may not think of as being, quote, on your side, right? And once you've listed them and the directly impacted folks, then you begin reaching out to your most obvious allies and expand from there, right? So back to the renters' rights idea, you would start by talking to renters. And then from there, you might talk to building managers. And from there, you might talk to landlords and building owners. You might talk to people who work on site at some of the larger complexes, things like that, depending on what it is you're going for, right? This is a great place to apply a power map, a network map, a landscape assessment. Someone may already be doing something. Now, that says week 2 because I forgot to delete that. This was originally part of a 6-week course that I taught on organizing as part of Eastern's Activism Residence. And I want to give a little brief summary of what these kinds of things are. Power maps, network maps, and landscape assessments. These are all tools that community organizers use to help get a sense of what is happening in their community. And we're not going to go over all of them, but to give you sort of a brief sense of what they are. A power map looks at, quite literally, who holds the power in the situation, who is closest and farthest away from the ability to give you what you want. And then also looks at who is most aligned with you in your goals, right? A network map looks at who's connected to whom. So if you're doing a network map of folks involved in organizing tenants here in Spokane County, one of the first places you might look at is the tenants union, right? That's an organization that does a lot of work. Well, then who's connected to them? Well, they're part of the Platform for Change Coalition, so SCAR is connected to them. Who else might be connected and involved in that organizing, right? And so you just sort of look at all these connections and draw lines between them so you get a sense of, hey, if I talk to this person over here, it could eventually lead to relationships with these people over here. They kind of look like spider webs, they're fun. Then you've got your landscape assessment. Landscape assessment basically is a strategic way of asking who's already doing what. Sometimes people say, oh my gosh, I really care about this issue. It's so important. I'm going to start a group right now. We're going to get together and we're going to fix this, right? Which is great, but could also be dangerous if you don't know who's already doing the work. So if I decided tomorrow, you know what, I'm going to start a bunch of organizing around tenants' rights, and I don't know that the tenants union exists, then I could be undermining work they're doing. I could be doing work that I don't need to do because I've already laid great foundations. I could be directly countering work or just duplicating work and thus potentially wasting my own efforts and the efforts of other people. When someone's already doing something, you want to see, hey, are they doing things in a way that I want to join in on? Maybe that complement what I want to do? Do I still want to start something new because I want to engage different people around the issue but collaborate? Those are all questions that a landscape assessment help you ask. This is also where you do your equity checks and noticing work. When you're determining your participants, you want to ask who isn't already at the table. Equity checks mean who might not be given the most obvious opportunity to be involved. So when you're thinking about tenants, are you thinking about people who are in government housing? Are you thinking about people who are in perhaps certain assisted living situations or semi-independent living situations? What do you need to think about in the course of that as you organize for protections for tenants? Right. And that's just an idea that I had. That's an area of my expertise. It's another reason why I'd go back to, say, an organization like the Tenants Union and say, hey, how are these people being engaged? Noticing work is about noticing where you sit in the issue, right? We all approach any issue that we look at with a certain degree of privilege and a certain degree, potentially, of oppression, right? So when I think about my own situation, I'll get a little bit personal for a sec. I'm a renter. I'm also decently middle class, right? My rent went up only a modest amount in the last several months, while some people had to deal with rent increases of several hundreds of dollars. Some people who saw their rent go up by 30, 40%. I only saw my rent go up by a pretty modest percentage, one that was easy for me and my household to absorb. That's a privilege, right? That's an economic privilege that I have. So if I'm interested in this issue, I need to recognize where I'm sitting. It's in the sort of, I don't want to say hierarchy, but in the map of folks who are impacted by an issue. Someone else might be privileged in that they're a landlord. I have a friend who owns her own home. She rents out a couple of rooms in that home. She is a landlord, but she also is a firm believer in tenants' rights. But she recognizes that she sits in a different place than the people who are renting from her. This is also a time to make sure that everyone is agreed on what you want collectively. That is what do we want, right? Because one person over here might say, I want rent control. Another person over here might say, oh, that's not really a priority for me. To look at maybe a slightly different issue, I'm going to pivot a little bit to like homelessness here in Spokane. Winter is coming. It's unclear what the plan is. And yet again, we're going to see potentially a lot of people die that we don't need to see die because of the lack of planning around that. What is it that we want to do? It's about getting people into more shelters. It's about getting people to more long-term housing. Who's the we? And is what we're asking when we determine our participants, and that we have to decide what the goal is. Next step is to determine your target. An inspiring action is cathartic, the kind of thing where you just go out and you fill the streets and you yell your heart out or you raise your voice. Those things can be emotionally very valuable. And they can also be a part of healing for a community or even just bringing people together for the beginning of something more thorough as a community, right? But an effective action helps you get what you want, right? Your ideal action target, that is the person who your action is aimed at, should be susceptible to pressure, capable of giving you what you want, or capable of forcing another person or entity to give you what you want. Some good examples of that might be elected officials. The more local or the closer to the issue, the better. If you've ever gone to like a city council meeting and heard someone talk about curriculum in local schools, that's an example of someone targeting the wrong person. They want to talk to maybe the school board or the superintendent of public schools, but instead they're talking to city council because that's just maybe the most obvious seat of power available to them. But that's an example of poor targeting, right? Good targeting, if you're going to a city council meeting, would be to talk to them about issues that they directly control, things to do with roads or police department funding. Let's stay here for a second. Also, examples of a good target include people with executive positions. So maybe you want to talk to the mayor or a CEO or an executive director, right? Or a business with an outsized interest or share in the problem that you're discussing, right? If you don't know who your target is, return to your power map, your network map, and your landscape assessment. Those are all tools that help you understand who has the power in the situation, who can give you what you want, and that's the person your action needs to be aimed at. Then you're going to define your action. You want to choose your action by considering some of the following questions. What are you going to do? That is quite physically, literally, what are you going to do? Are we marching? Are we sending symbolic gifts to somebody? What's up? And what are you willing to do? People have different levels of acceptable risk, right? Some people Oh, a great example of this is in the Poor People's Campaign in meetings a couple years ago. I remember the conversation being, okay, we're going to Olympia, we're sending up so many cars, raise your hand if you're willing to risk arrest. Okay, now raise your hand if you're not willing to risk arrest. Cars and other things were organized by those metrics. Now everybody participated, but people who weren't willing to risk arrest did things that were slightly different and participated in slightly different ways than those who were. And knowing what folks are willing to do also helps, I would say, secure the unity of the group, helps secure the effectiveness of the action itself, because then you don't have people running off in different directions, or people say, ooh, I'm not down with that tactic, but I am down with this tactic. You can have a lot of those discussions early on. Now, some of that stuff is always going to happen because there's always going to be diversity within a movement. And that's not only inevitable, that's good. But by talking about what you're willing to do from the beginning, you can get a sense of the tone of what's happening. Another time for an equity check. Can everyone do the thing? I mean, physically, can everyone do the thing? When we talk about accessibility, we often think an easy thing to look at is physical accessibility, right? So I don't know how long ago, because time is meaningless now in the wake of the pandemic, but the last time we had a big outdoor pride celebration in Spokane, there were a lot of complaints that because of where it was located, that is, I believe the Lilac Bowl in the park, people with mobility aids couldn't really get around to the booths. It was really difficult for a lot of people, including several of my friends who were both queer and disabled and had held both of those identities very closely to themselves. They wanted to be able to participate in this big event, wanted to immerse themselves in pride, and they couldn't because it simply just wasn't accessible. And people didn't think, oh, some queer people have walkers, some queer people have canes. Canes don't do well in grass, etc. Is everyone's safety and relative risk being considered? Now, I think of this in a couple of different ways. Safety is in basic physical safety. Sometimes there are different schools of thought around marches, whether or not they are something you should apply for to a permit for the police, or if you have different ideas about what a march should do, if you should avoid getting permits or avoid participating in any kind of government sanctioning of your event. But one of the arguments in favor of doing marches and things that inform the government in advance, including police or regulating agencies, is that it allows them to clear space so that people are physically safe from cars, just straight up, right? That's a consideration that a lot of people talk about. Now, whether you go with that or not, we're not going to hash out how marches should be done here, but that's a question that has to be asked. Can everyone go to this place and be there safely? What part of town is it in? Are we worried about vehicles? Are we worried about weather, for example? Summer marches and summer demonstrations should, at least in this area, always have water on hand, always. Do you have street medics for the event? Do you have what you need to make sure that nobody goes down from exhaustion or sunburn? Another thing to consider is risk. If we're talking about arrest, are there people who might want to participate who have criminal records, who can't risk being arrested again? People who might have warrants who don't want to risk being arrested. You never know who's in the group of people you're working with. And some of your best co-collaborators might be people who have different legal risks to consider than yourself. Not to mention, what about the people who live in the area? Are there houseless people around? Are you going to bring danger and police to people living on the street in that area by having your march go through this area? Right. So physical safety, legal safety, physical risk, legal risk. Those are all things to consider. And are there alternative ways to participate? Because obviously, when you answer these questions, you may find, oh man, I'm going to throw out some random numbers. 20% of our group is not able to risk arrest, and another 20% can't physically navigate the terrain to get to this location that we've decided would be the most impactful. So how do we make an action without cutting people out? And the short answer is that you have alternative ways to participate, right? Maybe you have a physical march for these people and you have a car parade for these other people, so that people are able to drive a route instead of walking. And that way they aren't likely to come in contact with, police or bad sidewalks or whatever. Maybe you have people participate online. There are various methods that you could use and combine to help maximize participation. And then the next thing, as you decide your action, is you got to plan ahead. Know how you're going to escalate. What do you do when your target says no? Because chances are, if your target was just going to say yes easily, you wouldn't need an action. Now, that's not true every time. Sometimes your target folds really quickly, and that's awesome. But if they don't, you need to know what you're going to do if they say no. You also need to know what you're going to do if they say yes. You don't want to be the dog that catches the car and doesn't know what to do with it. Right? You build up all this momentum. You've gotten all these people involved. You demand this thing. The party says, okay. And then you're like, oh, snap. Finally, you want to know how you will respond if you receive an invitation to talk. That's probably the most common response that you'll see often is no and let's talk, right? Where now you're entering into a negotiation. Do you know who is empowered to negotiate on behalf of your community and your collective? Do you know what the talking points are when you come in and sit down at that table that you're finally being invited to? So you want to know what's next if you say yes. You want to know what's next if they say no. You want to know what's next if you're invited to talk. And you need to remember that the you is always the collective. So let's talk about some examples of actions real quick. You could occupy a public building, right? That's a moderate to high risk activity depending on the building, right? You might be risking arrest depending on how long you want to occupy or if you're only doing it during business hours. You could do a phone bank, jam phone lines, such that, I remember being a part of an action where we were calling our Congress people. And it got to the point where so many thousands of people were making these automated calls to talk about this issue that their voicemails literally filled up with messages. And all their aides could do was just tally how many people were calling. And that was it. And that made a huge point, frankly. You could send 1 million emails. An email's a random number, but a lot of emails. We've seen the power of emails here in Spokane, where a previous police contract was rejected because, in the words of our then city council, or now city council president, Brian Beggs, he'd never seen, quote, so much democracy in the form of all these emails. You could send 1 million postcards. You could silently follow around a corrupt politician or official with wearing a t-shirt that proclaims their shame. That's actually something that I've seen done, and it's hilarious. Imagine if every time a politician or an official of some kind was trying to get a photo op, there was someone behind them wearing a t-shirt saying, shame on you for policy X. It makes a point. You can also leave hundreds of cheap symbolic gifts in office. I don't remember if this is actually a true story or an urban legend. It might be an urban legend, but of a politician who received a not insignificant number of rubber chickens at their official office because they were being chicken about a policy. So once you've decided what you want to do, the next step is to plan it out, because it's not enough to say, all right, we're going to march and then just go. You've got logistics to consider, right? So right off the top, I'm going to lay it all out. And you want to do this as a team, as a core group of planning people. And I don't keep saying this, collective, collective, collective. It's important to recognize that, of course, it is very difficult to have everything be 100% democratic and have absolutely every person at the table. If you have a coalition, for example, of say 100 people, you're not going to get all 100 of them onto the same call or in the same room to make all these decisions. But there's probably going to be a representative group of people who can adequately represent those 100. And that can be the we that's empowered to make decisions often. Your mileage may vary, your structures may vary. But with that team, you need to answer basic: who, what, where, when, and how. So let me think of something. Homeless advocates and homeless people and residents of Spokane who care are going to march on City Hall on Christmas Eve by meeting at Riverfront Park and making their way from there, right? Who, what, where, when, how. Is there monetary cost involved, right? Are we getting permits and potentially paying for that? Is there a cost to send people ahead and make sure that the route is clear, to make sure that if there's snow on the ground, that the pathway is accessible? What are the social and legal risks of marching on City Hall? Are we taking up the streets? Are we putting ourselves in a position to be arrested, or are we being pretty demure about all this? How much time is required? Are we marching for 20 minutes, an hour? How accessible is this action? What about people who physically cannot march or who physically cannot deal with the cold? What about people who may not have the time? Who are the spokespeople? Once we get there, are we just yelling en masse, or does somebody have something to say? Do we have a unified message that we're sending? Who's going to talk to the press? Is there a communications plan? That is, now to dig in more, who's talking to the press, who's talking to the public, and who's talking to participants? Those are three different things, right? You got your outward facing message, your message to the community, and your message to everybody who you've already got on your side about how this is going and what happens next. And what's your support plan? Legal aid, jail support, mutual aid, food, money, housing. A great example of support planning is whenever unions do strikes. You'll notice that you might see every now and again, like a GoFundMe or a fund or something saying support the such and such strikers. Because when they're not working and they're not getting paid, that means that they are risking through their work stoppage, eviction and hunger and other loss of basic needs. All right. Do you have these things worked out? So you want to continue doing your equity checks. You want to make sure that every person has a job. Everyone on your team, the people who have agreed to get their hands dirty in this, everyone should have a job, even if that job is just show up on the day. You want to make sure every job has an owner. Whenever you say, hey, wouldn't it be great if someone, don't end the meeting before someone is defined. Make sure that someone is checking in on everybody. I'm a firm believer that there's got to be at least one person in every planning group whose job is just to be annoying and be like, hey, did you get the permit yet? Hey, have you secured the water yet? Hey, I'm checking the master checklist. Have you done blah, blah, blah? And then finally, make sure someone is taking notes. That person is so important. Doesn't help to make decisions if you have no record of what those decisions were. Step 5, you got plan your homework. If your action involves members of the general public joining in, like most marches and rallies, you need crowd homework. This is actually one of my favorite things. Because if people leave your rally and they can't answer the question, what's next, the energy is going to dissipate and your movement will lose momentum. People need to know what the next step is, or otherwise it's, ooh, that was a great march. Okay. You need to make sure that everyone in the core planning team knows what they're going to do immediately after the action, right? So is it after this happens, we are going to go, I'm going to go make sure that I deliver all of the postcards we collected to City Hall. Or after this happens, I'm going to make sure that everyone who showed up gets a text thanking them for showing up or something, right? And someone needs to be in charge of a post-action party. Again, totally serious here, because movements are exhausting and often they revolve around trauma and difficult things, frankly. You spend all this time thinking about an issue and digging into something that's important, whether it be the people who might die because of the cold weather and houselessness, whether it be police brutality, whether it be rising rent rates, whatever it is. We get involved in this stuff because it tugs on our soul. So when we do an action, we need to take the time to celebrate. Next is to just execute the plan. Remember to distribute your crowd homework and follow through on any immediate escalation steps. That is the yes, no, or let's talk. Whatever that is, move on it. And of course, the next thing is the party. Now, a note on the party. A lot of parties in this environment, for a lot of people, tend to revolve around some of the few gathering spaces that we have, often bars, right? I'm a big believer in having sober option parties, right? I don't do as good a job of this as I would like, but even if you do want to have a thing at a bar, make sure it's a bar that knows that some people are going to be sober, that has a few decent mocktails or something on hand. Make sure that if you're doing a house party, you have something other than like literally Capri Sun for people who don't want to booze it up to drink. I have heard stories of people who went to events and were like, okay, so I don't drink, what do I have? And they get pointed to a kid's cooler. No one wants that. Then you've got your follow-up. It's the last step. And we did a lot here, but we're finally at the end here. Congrats, you did the thing. You went on the march, you sent your emails, you sent the rubber chickens, you followed around the politician with kazoos, whatever it was. All right. Now you need to debrief with your core team. You got to talk afterwards. How did it go? What could we have done better? What was worse? Whether you want to do a general check-in or rose, thorn, and flower bud feedback situation, whatever. It's all up to you. Just make sure that you talk. You also need to have a different debrief for all the stakeholders and directly impacted folks. It's an opportunity for people to come back and say, hey, I didn't feel like that action really represented me. Or I really like that action. I'd want to participate more fully next time. Or, as a stakeholder in this, I wasn't really quite on your side with this. I was holding back and now I'm hearing your demands and they seem kind of reasonable to me. You want to make sure that all these people have a chance to give their feedback as well, that they're engaged really as well. And that's where action planning drifts into organizing. You also want to send out a communication to your general public participants, if you have any. I say if you have any, because obviously not every action is for the public. There are more closed off actions, like a strike, for example. That's specific to a particular industry, particular place. They're striking, the rest of us aren't, right? But if we're talking about things where there's general public participation, then what do you send to them afterwards? Hopefully your homework and follow up on that homework that we talked about earlier. Follow up with the press if relevant. You want to make sure that you don't just do the sort of pre-script, but also the postscript. So an example of this was SCAR and the SCAR Platform for Change Coalition and Smart Justice Spokane did a press conference on August 5 about police reform bills that passed in Washington state. We sent out a press release in advance and we sent out a press packet afterwards, right? So that we could shape the narrative of how the story of that action was told. And after that, nice work. So let's go through the practice real quick. We're going to choose one of these scenarios to work through real quick so we can kind of see how it functions. So I'm going to read them out and then y'all are going to get to vote. And then whoever's online, you can vote by typing into the chat or by vocalizing which one you want. Also, for anyone who's wondering, we're going to have time for some questions and stuff afterwards. So first scenario number one. Dozens of homeless people we're going to go with Spokane, are currently left without adequate shelter services during the winter. That's a scenario. Second one, hundreds of renters and properties owned by 3 different landlords in Spokane have received letters saying that if they're not up to date with their rent, they will automatically be evicted as soon as the state's eviction moratorium is lifted. Kind of relevant right now. I've looked at something pretty similar currently happening. The university you attend announces the budget for ethnic and diversity studies departments will be cut by 50% in the next school budget. Also perhaps relevant to people in this area. And the sheriff's department in, let's say, Spokane County announces the hiring of several deputies who have a documented history of broken trust with communities of color in the places where they were previously hired. All right, it looks like we're looking at number 4. All right, next slide then. All right, so this is all going to be you. So we're going to start up here with step 1 was define your participants. Can you name 1 to 3 directly impacted parties? And let's say 3. Can this group brainstorm 3 directly impacted parties to the situation number 4, where again, the sheriff has hired several deputies who have a history of broken trust with communities of color in the places where they used to work. Okay, so 1, communities of color within Spokane County are directly impacted by this hiring decision. All right, who else? Unhoused communities. All right, that's another one. Who else? Previous communities. So I would say that, say that again? Black car drivers, absolutely. Now, you said people in the communities where they previously worked. I would say that they're more like a stakeholder because they're no longer directly impacted by deputies who've moved away from them, but they are still a stakeholder potentially in the issue of how we respond to this. All right, so what we've got so far now are unhoused people, communities of color in Spokane, and specifically Black car drivers. And then for stakeholders, we have people in the communities where these deputies were previously hired, can we get 2 more additional stakeholders? The sheriff himself. Yeah, absolutely. Sheriff. Who else? Okay, so anyone who's at risk of police violence. I feel like that in some ways covers all of our previous directly impacted groups. Can you think of someone who may not be, someone who's a stakeholder who may not necessarily be on the negatively impacted, the immediate negatively impacted side, or someone who isn't necessarily being policed? Business owners. Explain why they're a stakeholder. It's okay if it's not like a perfect thing. I just want to hear your thinking. Okay, so to repeat that, maybe these deputies are policing in a way that benefits business owners to the detriment of those they're policing. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay, all right, so that's great. Those are some stakeholders. So that's step 1 ticked off. Now, obviously, this whole process is a much larger discussion, but for the sake of this practice, mission accomplished. You've defined your participants probably by looking at this list. Who do you think from that list of people who we talked about? So I'm going to list them off real quickly. You're doing an action again around the sheriff hiring these deputies who have histories of broken trust with communities of color, right? And we talked about Black drivers, communities of color in Spokane, and unhoused people, and other stakeholders included the sheriff, business owners, and I'm blanking on the third one. City council members who constituents complain to. That's definitely a stakeholder in this issue. So from that list of people who we talked about, and I wish we had like a whiteboard, the teacher in me is like, I need all of these written down. Who might we decide, just for the purposes of tonight, are our participants in any action that we're going to do? Yeah, exactly. The communities of color in Spokane. Everyone who's directly impacted, those are probably people you want to participate. And then some of the stakeholders are going to be as well, right? Not all of them, but some of them. Nice job, everyone. So let's then determine our target. So who is it that can give us what we want or make someone else able to do that? Now, in order to figure that out, there's a certain degree of what is it that we want generally that we need to determine in this conversation. What was said was, in this situation, the deputies, these sheriff's deputies, may not actually be a very good target because they can't give us what we want, which you defined as their firing, their removal from position, right? So if we've decided, we've done all this talking to our participants, that what we want is for those deputies to be removed from their positions, then the deputies are not a good target. That's fantastic. Another thing worth noting is another question, besides can they give us what we want or make someone else do it, is are they susceptible to pressure from your community, right? Depending on who your community is. Because here's the thing. At the end of the day, if you're asking someone for something who doesn't owe you anything, they can ignore you no matter how big your numbers are. One way to think about this is when people send letters to the city of Spokane, but they live in, say, Spokane Valley, right? If they're spamming the, city council office or whatever with a bunch of emails about an issue that they really care about, but they don't actually live in the city limits, ultimately, at the end of the day, any city council member could choose to say, meh, doesn't really matter what you think, you don't vote for me, right? Same thing with any action you're doing. Do you have a direct line of influence to this person? Now, who do we think might make a good target who is susceptible from pressure from this group? What's up? All right, awesome. All right, so as a potential target, the Human Resource Office. Do we feel like that office would listen to, let's just say for the purpose of this collection of Spokane residents who live in the county? Do we feel like they're susceptible to pressure from this group? So I'm going to repeat that. So, and make sure I get this right, but you're saying that might be pretty easy pressure to absorb because of the relationship where the hiring of these people reflects on them. And so they're likely to protect those jobs and those people in those jobs, right? So the answer to that question is, what's up? So letting them know that we want background checks on the people applying. So then that's a different ask, right? What we're saying, we're targeting then this office and saying, hey, the ask is we want background checks on people who you hire as deputies. Absolutely. Background checks would be a long-term solution, long-term plan. And something I want to illustrate is the difference between the different answers that we're getting. This is the strategy conversation you have to have when you're considering what you want. Are you asking for a short-term thing? We want these guys fired. Are you asking for a long-term thing? We want background checks before you hire these people. Are you asking for both? There's no rule that says you have to ask for either or, right? There's a lot more discussion that could happen here, but I want to kind of keep it rolling so that we get a feel for all these steps. So let's say that we ask for both things. We're going to ask for these deputies to be fired, and we're asking for background checks in the future. And we're going to target this human resource office. Now, I'm going to go out here and be a little bit didactic and say, I think that that's kind of a difficult target. I think it's a worthy target because of the position of power that they hold. But we might want to target multiple people, like, say, the sheriff himself, who is very responsible for those hires and is elected. So then our voices around this issue represent votes that they might get or not get, depending on how they respond to our demands, right? So I also want to do away with the assumption that there's only going to be one target. You want to have a focused set of targets. You don't want to just target generally the city, or the county, but targeting multiple people with different degrees of power and stake in the issue can help you be a bit more surgical in how you go forward. And it also depends on a lot of things, like how much bandwidth do you have? How many people do you have behind you? Chances are, if you're just getting going, it's just the beginning. Your first few actions aren't going to get you very far, but you have to start somewhere. Any more comments from chat? All right. So let's talk about step 3. In this hypothetical, let's say that we're asking for firing of these deputies. We're asking for background checks for the future, and we're targeting the human resource office and the sheriff himself. What are we going to do?
Okay, so my idea is that the human resources number is going to be kind of easy to get a hold of. So flooding the phone lines and stating our course of action, like our demands and everything like that, would be, an inclusive and accessible option for us.
That's a great idea, right? So on the human resources side, flooding their office with phone calls, that's probably going to make an impact. Do you have any other ideas? Ways that we could perhaps approach our other target of the sheriff in this case? But yeah, so emails, emailing them is a great idea. And you just remembered, what's up?
A petition of many people within the community saying we won't vote for you if you continue to hire and if you don't fire them.
Nice. That's a great idea. So we've talked about jamming phone lines. We talked about sending lots of emails and mail from lots of different people. And we've talked about a petition that pledges to not vote for the sheriff if he doesn't respond to these demands, right? That's a great set of actions. So we have the what, and it seems like these are by and large relatively inclusive and accessible, right? So maybe people who can't make phone calls can send emails. People who don't want to compose their own email because they're not sure what to say can get on to sign a petition. There's lots to choose from. So nice work. Step 3 done. So then we plan our action, our who, what, where, when, and why. Now I'm going to summarize this because I think y'all already put this together. So the who, we've got concerned Spokane residents. Right now, we are the who, the people in this room. The what, we have emails, phone calls, mailed statements, and a petition, right? The where, well, that's happening in Spokane County from our computers and our mail slots, right? And our phones. The when, this is probably a moment when you would choose a timeline, like we're going to do all of this between now and Christmas or something, right? With these sorts of actions, the when might be strategic in terms of, election cycles or other things you've got going on, but it's not a hard one to parse out. And the why, well, because we want to see these particular deputies gone, and we want to see background checks instituted for future hires. All right, so check. Then we've got to plan the homework. So what can people do after they've sent their email, made their phone call, signed a petition? What can they do after that to continue pursuing this cause?
Maybe there could be like a response in response to the action of either like the phone call or the emails or the petition, just kind of saying like, we're going to continue working on this, but like you can do this again in a week to keep up the pressure, or like share this with a few people that you think might be interested in it or something like that.
All right, so we could have the action essentially on repeat, or say, hey, once you've done this, please share it with, you said 10 people or something like that. Yeah, all right, so please share it with this many people when you're done. It's a great idea. Do we have any other ideas?
Robert says, let the public know what the responses were by HR and the sheriff.
That is super important. I would suggest that the bit about letting the public know what the responses were, all of that is stuff that we would include in step 8, right? The debrief. We've done the action. What is the result? And that's extremely important to keep the community informed on any outcomes. So thanks for that. Let's say we have that homework of send this to 10 people, right? And we're going to repeat this in a week. Next step is essentially to just do it, right? So you got to spend time writing template emails, writing up the petition, getting that phone number that you talked about and circulating it, doing any social media you want to do, advertising, all of that, right? There's all that logistical planning. What might a successful action outcome look like in this case?
The firing of the officers that were unreputable in the last city they came from.
Bingo. You get what you want. They're fired. You get a new policy put in place that establishes a background check, and responding to that background check by, this wasn't stated explicitly, but I'm going to state it explicitly now. The point of having that check is that if these things come up again, we don't hire people with a particular type of history, right? So that's success. The next step is to party. This is sort of just a fun question I like to ask, talk about this one. What is one way that you think you would enjoy celebrating a success like this? It's a fantastic example, rewarding volunteers and saying, hey, let's celebrate together on all this awesome work that we've done for Brutus for the People. So, all right, so we've got some ideas about how we can celebrate. And then of course, yes, that's super important. Publicly acknowledge those who participated in the action, right? Everyone who got involved, you want to say thank you for making this happen. This is a team effort. This is a we, and you celebrate and acknowledge that we. So once we've done it, we've had our party, then we debrief, right? So I think that returns to the comment that Bob left us earlier. Let the public know what the response was to the action. Yep. And find out how many people completed the action. That's super important. You want to keep track of what was done, what kind of momentum you have, you can also use that in future actions. Say, last time we asked for this, 327 people sent emails or whatever, there were 700 phone calls, there were 25 mailed letters. And you can use that to promote the action the next time you repeat it. And you could also use that as a good metric for what you're going to do going forward. And it's a great opportunity to get a sense of the community that you're building around the issue. So final discussion or questions. We don't necessarily have to go through all these. These are just questions you can think about. I'm just going to read through them because I'd really love to just share and talk for the next few minutes. I'm wondering if there's something that you learned during this activity, during this process. If there's anything that came really easy to you, or if there's anything that was particularly difficult for you to think through. How might you apply the stuff from this that you learned during your activity, during this activity, to your own change-making efforts? How are you going to use this later? And do you have any comments or questions? Again, that particular question is out of date. I need to update the PDF I sent everybody, but do you have any questions about this and how it sort of coordinates with other things you might know? And let's just skip to the last slide. And what I'm going to do is, it looks like I've got 2 questions. So I'm just going to pass the mic and you can.
In terms of what was difficult about the action planning activity, I thought it was hard to think about what homework people should do, just because like I feel like momentum is something that can die so quickly if you're not careful, and it's kind of like a lot of pressure to formulate like something for people to continue on with. So like I think the pressure of that and like just generally not knowing what good homework looks like kind of stressed me out, and like that was definitely the hardest part.
Totally valid. I'll come to you next. One way to take some of the pressure off of that is to think of it less like I have to come up with the perfect activity or all the momentum will die and the movement will die, like take the crisis out of it and instead focus on what do we need, right? So let's say that we get out of our hypothetical action. The sheriff refuses to fire the deputies, but the HR office says, let's talk to your community representatives. Now you have a let's talk conversation happening, right? From that outcome, what might you need next? Do you need more community feedback? Could the homework be something like fill out this survey and share it with 5 of your friends? Could it be tell us about your experience here? Could it be make a phone call to the Human Resources Office reiterating these points that you want in the upcoming discussion? Right. And since you should already know in advance what your escalation steps are from, no, yes, and let's talk, you can plan that homework in advance and be like, okay, well, if they say no, we're going to do this, and we're going to ask people to do that. If they say yes, then we're just going to celebrate and have people show up at this place to honor this win. If they say, let's talk, then we're going to ask for community feedback around this. We're going to ask for a community to share these talking points or whatever. If you think about it in terms of the overarching campaign and the movement that you're participating in, as opposed to just a single point in time, which is how we often think of actions, that can help kind of spur a sense of like, okay, this is what's next. This is what, as a team, we need to figure out going forward. And it's also okay if you don't have the perfect homework, just as long as you have a way to keep in touch with people who participated, whether you collected phone numbers and emails, whether you have a set time that people are going to show up at another date to repeat, to celebrate, whatever. As long as you have something that keeps that relationship going, then you'll probably be in good shape.
So what I learned is going back to what Emma and Jac said was about the homework. I didn't know that we needed to do that or plan it and to plan what to do when they say yes, what to do when they say no, and what to do when they talk. So that was very important. So thank you. And then a question that I have is that you said that this was a class. Is there still a class where we can take to further understand and further educate ourselves?
So the short answer is no. The long answer is, maybe one day. I can keep doing these. This was originally 1 week of a 6-week activist in residence course that I did for Eastern Washington University through the Wage Center, the Women's and Gender Equality Center, I think. I want to make sure that I'm saying that right. They do the AIR program or the Activist in Residence program every year. And this last year, they invited me to be that person. And that's what this was developed for as part of a larger curriculum around making change. So that's the original class that I referenced. And I can certainly keep doing this. Eastern Washington University Wage Center, Women and Gender Equality, I think. But Wage Center should get you there. I'm hoping it's gender equality. It might be gender equity.
Yeah, I was just wondering, kind of when we were talking about campaigns as opposed to just single actions. So in that context of like starting a really long campaign, I know it's probably pretty specific on what you're doing, but like, is there like a tried and true, like ideal first action to do? Like, do you go big and then like kind of do a couple of small ones, then go big again, like to bookend that, or start small, work your way up? Like,
you're definitely right in that it's hugely variable. I can tell you about some of the tactics some people use when they're organizing these things. Right off the bat, a lot of people like to start with a big kickoff, right? They approach it the same way an activist campaign, they approach it the same way we approach political campaigns. So there's a big party or something, a massive event. And then from there, you have smaller actions and you kind of bookend things. Now you might have a big one in the middle. And sometimes that climax is planned. Sometimes it's not planned. There's so much that depends upon the response of your target, the response of the community, how momentum builds. You can't plan every moment of it, but you can kind of plan the skeleton of how you're going to escalate things, how you want things to go. Other campaigns that rely on smaller, perhaps scrappier groups of folks might start out really small. And the sort of initial kickoff might actually just be the quiet living room community meeting where people kind of agree, this is what we're working on. And you just keep gathering people along and building from there. There's no single action that's tried and true, but I'll say this, when considering your tactics and how you want to begin, a good thing to keep in mind is that how you start is going to help determine the tone of how you pursue that whole goal. If you're doing something really big and public and bombastic, people are going to expect a big public and bombastic campaign. If you're doing something subtle and maybe long-term but very low-key, then you can definitely build bigger, but people aren't going to be surprised by smaller things and people might plug in more quietly. And it also has to do a lot with your audience. You know, if your action is for the general public or for a specific community in the general public, it's going to look different than if it's something internal, like, you know, a strike within a business or something like that. And one thing I also want to put out there is a lot of times people think that big and flashy is better. We think a march was successful because hundreds of people showed up, or a rally was great because we shut down traffic for so long or whatever. And that is definitely part of it. But small actions can still be successful if they help you move towards your goal. And sometimes you don't want to go big and flashy. If you're doing work with, say, the immigrant population or the population of undocumented immigrants, you might not want the biggest, flashiest action all the time. You know, people have different needs and risks, but does that help? Okay.
I just wanted to say that this is probably my favorite of all our Know Your Rights trainings, because it gets me the most excited to plan more actions and do more things.
Thank you. And I want to put out there that, you know, I didn't just get all this knowledge out of a vacuum. Credit due, I went through the Pajau's Young Activist Leadership Program, or YELP. I was a, let me see, YELPista class of 2018, I want to say. I might have that year wrong. But I went through that, which definitely taught me a lot. A lot of that information comes from the work of Marshall Gans. And then a lot of this stuff, you know, also just comes from like learning about event planning and learning about history. But I had a lot of really great teachers and mentors to help me understand this material so that I can share it effectively. So I'm glad it's really useful to folks.
Going on that note, what did you say? What was the program you said to be more like you?
So that was the Young Activist Leadership Program, or YALP. It's put on by the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane. The program has evolved quite a bit since I was in it. I would say all for the good. It's a really, really great program that is now youth-led. And I'm not sure exactly all of the age focuses that they have, but Pajau's has a lot of activist development in general. They did like a series of Wednesday webinars at one point, sort of taking a lot of that material and aiming it at an older audience at one point. I did YELP back in college. I'm sure you could reach out to the executive director there, Liz Moore, or to the, you know, anyone else connected and see maybe when another class opens up or what other opportunities there are to learn some of these skills. Any other questions? All right. Oh, anything from our online audience? All right. All right.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. All right. All right. Well, thanks everyone. As it's the end of this and the end of recording. Thanks to people who came online and to people who watch this later and to all of you who helped make this happen.